I'm aware that not everyone will be familiar with the ins and outs of state aid and subsidy control, let alone exactly what the new bill says. So I'm just going to briefly talk about, sort of outline the area here to get people up to speed. When we're talking about subsidies in this area, what we're talking about is transfers from governments and public bodies to businesses that are selective. So they're available to some businesses, but not all businesses. Why would a government want to have a legal regime that might restrict the use of subsidies? Well, one reason is just to ensure good value of taxpayer money, make sure that subsidies are actually achieving the change that they're meant to, they're not distorting economic activity. But particularly in a system where subnational governments have the power to offer subsidies, there's a risk of subsidy races where different areas compete for activity in a way that's damaging for the country as a whole. And you see that quite a lot in the US, for example. Now, actually, there aren't many examples of legal subsidy control regimes around the world. And if we're talking about domestic regimes like the type the UK is going to set up, really the EU system is the only game in town. But the UK is going to set up a new system, actually already has a new system, and it's required to do so as a result of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So, excuse me, very briefly, very high level, what does the EU state aid system do? Well, effectively, the European Commission plays the role of gatekeeper. Any subsidy that might affect trade, and there's quite a low bar for that in the EU system, is considered illegal unless and until it's approved by the Commission. There are two routes for getting your subsidy approved. One is to notify the Commission, which will then evaluate the benefits and costs against a set of criteria. That could take 6 months or more, and they'll let you know whether or not you can do your subsidy. Or alternatively, if you want a quicker and less uncertain route, you can go for automatic approval via the block exemptions, which are effectively long checklists for your subsidy to meet. If you meet all of those criteria, then the EU Commission is happy that your subsidy is unlikely to distort activity, and therefore you can do it automatically. So what about the proposed new UK system? Well, it will work very differently. Gone is the presumption of illegality of a subsidy until it's approved. Instead, we have a system that will be based on private enforcement. Public bodies and governments are required to self-assess whether their subsidy complies with 7 broad principles. For example, will it meet a public policy objective? Is it proportionate? Does it minimise impacts on competition and investment in the UK? It will then register that on a database, and interested parties, which could be, say, a competitor business, will then have 28 days to start the process to bring a judicial review, effectively a court challenge as to whether that self-assessment of compliance with the principles is reasonable and correct. There is another body involved in the system, but it's got nothing like the power of the Commission in the EU regime. The Subsidy Advice Unit is going to be set up in the CMA. For some subsidies that might be distortive based on criteria to be determined, the analysis that public bodies and governments do about compliance with the principles will be sent to the CMA for review. The CMA will publish a report. It may raise concerns, but it has no power to block some subsidies, and nor could it be an interested party challenging it in court. One final thing to say about the new UK system and how it works is the role of schemes. Subsidies under pre-approved schemes cannot be challenged during using the mechanisms in the bill. Schemes can be set up in 2 ways. They can either be set up by public bodies in the same way that subsidies are, so self-assessing compliance with the principles, putting it on the database, waiting 28 days to see if there's a challenge. The government will also set up its own version in streamlined routes. So will this be a successful system? Well, the first thing to say is that at the moment, we're very much judging the skeleton of the system rather than the full detail. The bill leaves lots of important information to be filled in secondary legislation. For example, which types of subsidies will be referred to the CMA. But just looking at that framework, actually, I think there's a lot to commend it. And it's pretty similar to a system that we proposed at the IFG in a paper published last year. I think it's appropriate in a UK domestic context to have a more flexible system. And there's an opportunity both for smaller subsidies offered by local authorities and larger subsidies designed by, say, government departments to work with less administrative costs. However, there are risks. The subsidy advice unit is weak, has few powers, and the 28-day challenge period is very short. And that, combined with the role of schemes, I think does risk leaving some harmful subsidies to slip through the net. We don't know exactly how the Competition Appeal Tribunal will take on its role of judicial review, what will be considered sufficient evidence that you're complying with the principles. Initially, at least, I think that means there is likely to be some hesitancy from some granting bodies, at least, but that's likely to dissipate as the system beds in. There's a limited role for devolved governments, even though this will impact on devolved competence, both in rulemaking and governance. There's been no reform, for example, to the governance of the CMA, and the Secretary of State has some unique powers within the system that devolved ministers do not. And finally, Article 10 of the Northern Ireland Protocol says that subsidies that will affect trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic will still be subject to EU state aid rules. If that's interpreted very expansively, that could leave lots of big subsidies offered in Great Britain still subject to EU rules. And if that were to be the case, that would kind of blow a hole in the UK system, because the most important subsidies would still be being litigated in Brussels. There's no guarantee that that is the case, but that is a risk.